A 17-year-old boy was stabbed in the chest, and within moments he was gone. The person responsible didn't run, she didn't deny being there. Instead, she gave an explanation that would define everything that followed. She said it was horseplay. Not a fight, not an attack. Horseplay. But here's the problem. A stab wound to the chest isn't something people easily accept as an accident. And for Keimo Lollar's family, that explanation didn't just feel wrong, it felt impossible. Because Keimo wasn't just another name in a headline. He was 17, a high school student in Miami, a football player. A young man with direction, with plans, with a future that was already beginning to take shape. And in one moment, that future was gone. His ex-girlfriend was standing right there when it happened. She admitted she had the knife. She admitted there was contact. But according to her, it wasn't meant to happen. So now the question becomes unavoidable. How does something described as play end in a fatal stab wound? Was this truly a tragic accident between two teenagers? Or is that explanation hiding something more serious? Because as this case moves forward, more details begin to surface about their relationship, about the moments leading up to that night, and about what happened after Keimo collapsed in that parking garage. You'll see how quickly things escalated, how one decision changed everything, and how this case eventually made its way through the courtroom. But even with those answers, one question never really goes away. What actually happened in those final moments? Before we get into it, I want to hear from you. Have you ever come across a case where something this serious was described as an accident? And where are you watching from today? Because this one leaves very little room for simple answers. Welcome, this is Dark Trace Crime Stories, where we break down real cases that leave more questions than answers. Stick with me, because this one gets complicated.
Now, this is another breaking story we're following for you. A teenage girl stabbed her boyfriend to death amid an argument, and today, nearly 2 years later, she's pleaded guilty. The deadly stabbing happened in Northwest Miami-Dade, December of 2024.
Keimo Lollar was still in high school, but his life already had direction. He was a student at Miami Northwestern Senior High, known for staying focused both in and out of the classroom. On the football field, he played running back, a role that demands discipline, quick thinking, and control. Those who knew him said that same mindset showed up in how he carried himself every day. His father described him as the ultimate competitor. Not just in sports, but in life. He wasn't someone constantly caught up in trouble. He stayed on track, kept close to his family, and valued the people around him. One of those close connections was his aunt, a deputy with the Miami-Dade Police Department. Someone who saw firsthand the kind of young man he was becoming. Keimo wanted to become a stockbroker, a goal that showed he was thinking beyond the present. He was building towards something stable, something bigger than where he was. Graduation was getting closer. Prom was around the corner. Adulthood was within reach. But while his future was taking shape, something else in his life was starting to fall apart. At the center of this case was a relationship. Keimo Lollar had been involved with a teenage girl named Jahara Malik. They were young, still in school, still figuring things out. And like many relationships at that age, it didn't stay stable for long. By December 2024, things between them had already started to break down. There were arguments, tension that didn't seem to go away, and eventually a breakup. Exactly what was said during those arguments isn't fully known. The details of every disagreement haven't all been made public. But what is clear, from both investigators and family accounts, is that the relationship had reached a point where it could no longer hold together. And yet, even after it ended, communication didn't stop. They were still in contact. That's important, because in many situations like this, distance can help calm things down. But here, that distance never fully existed. Whatever issues had been building didn't just disappear, they carried over. We don't know everything about what they were saying to each other during that time, but we do know this. The tension didn't end with the breakup. It followed them. And as the days went on, that tension continued to build in the background, unresolved, unsettled, and still active. Then came the night of December 20th, 2024, just days before Christmas. At some point that night, Keimo and Jahara were on the phone again. Another conversation. Another moment where whatever had been lingering between them came back to the surface. And this one didn't stay contained to a phone call. According to family accounts, an argument took place during that call. What exactly triggered it isn't fully detailed, but it was enough to push things further than before. Because after that conversation ended, Jahara made a decision. She went to his apartment complex. That choice, leaving wherever she was, going directly to where he lived, shifted everything from words to proximity, from distance to confrontation. Now they weren't just two people arguing over the phone anymore. They were about to be face to face. And that changes the stakes. Again, there are limits to what has been publicly confirmed about what each of them was thinking in that moment. There's no full transcript of that call. No complete record of every emotion involved. But what we do know is enough to understand the direction things were moving in. There had been a breakup, there had been repeated arguments, there was still communication after things ended. And on that night, after another argument, one of them decided to show up in person. That's the point where situations can shift quickly. Because once distance is removed, there's no buffer. No pause between reactions. No time to step away and cool off. Everything becomes immediate. And in this case, that immediacy would matter. By the time Jahara arrived at the apartment complex in Liberty City, whatever had been building between them was no longer just tension in the background. It was right there. Present. Unresolved. And now unavoidable. Two teenagers, one broken relationship, and a situation that had already gone further than it should have. At this point, things were already going wrong. What do you think was building here? Because what happened next would only take seconds to change everything. It was around 11 p.m. The meeting point was the parking garage, 3rd floor. That's where Yakim and Jahara Malik crossed paths again after their argument earlier in the evening. At some point during the interaction, things shifted. A knife was present. How it was brought into the situation is part of what later became heavily disputed. But what followed next is not in question. Yakim Lollar was stabbed in the chest. One moment, he was standing there. The next, he was critically wounded. The injury was severe from the start. A chest wound like that leaves very little room for delay, and within seconds, the situation changed from an argument between two teenagers into a life-threatening emergency. Emergency services were called. Responders arrived and Yakim was rushed from the scene to the hospital. Inside the emergency room, medical teams worked to stabilize him. But despite their efforts, the injury was too serious. Yakim Lollar was pronounced dead. A 17-year-old student. A football player. A young man with plans that had not yet had the chance to unfold. And at the center of it all, Jahara Malik. She remained at the scene. She gave a statement. And what she said would immediately become one of the most debated parts of this entire case. According to her account, this was not an intentional act. She described it as horseplay. She said there was movement between them, an interaction that was not meant to turn violent. She explained that during that moment, they collided, and in that collision, the knife went into Yakim's chest. That explanation would go on to shape how the early stages of the case were understood, argued, and questioned. Because standing against it was the reality of what had just happened. A fatal stab wound to the chest, a teenager dead in a parking garage, just days before Christmas. And two completely different interpretations of the same moment. One version described it as an accident during rough interaction. The other, based on the severity of the injury, raised immediate doubts that could not be easily dismissed. At that stage, investigators were left with a single urgent reality. A young man had lost his life, and the only surviving account of how it happened came from the person who was there with him. The scene had already been processed. Statements were being collected. The timeline was being pieced together hour by hour. But even in those early moments, one issue stood out clearly. How does a situation described as horseplay result in a stab wound that proves fatal within minutes? That question didn't have an answer yet. But it would follow this case into every stage that came after. And that explanation would become the center of everything that followed.
Dean says Keimo, a student at Miami Northwestern Senior High School, loved playing football, video games, and spending time with family.
We're getting ready for senior breakfast, we're getting ready for prom, and we're getting ready for college. And now this happened.
A bright future now cut short.
My son is dead. And how is that fair to me? And you took his life.
Jean says she wants Keimo to be remembered by how he lived, not how he died.
I don't want people to remember him from this tragedy. I want people to remember him from the positive.
And the mother says that Keimo wanted to work in finance and had big dreams of becoming a stockbroker.
In the hours after Yakim Lollar's death, the reality of what had happened began to spread through his community in Miami. A 17-year-old life had ended in a Liberty City parking garage, and for those who knew him, the news didn't feel real at first. It didn't settle in as a headline. It landed as a personal loss. Soon after, gatherings began forming. Friends, classmates, and family members came together in small vigils to remember him. Candles were lit. Photos were shared. Silence replaced conversation in moments where words didn't feel enough. His family spoke publicly about their grief. They described disbelief. The difficulty of accepting that someone so young, so focused, and so full of direction was suddenly gone. Keimo was remembered not just for who he was on the field or in school, but for how he carried himself around the people closest to him. For them, the explanation that had been given early on did not provide comfort. It raised more questions than answers. As the days passed, attention shifted from mourning to concern about what would happen next in the case. No immediate charges were announced. That absence of a clear legal response quickly became a point of frustration for many who were following the situation. People wanted clarity. They wanted to understand how the law would interpret what had happened in that parking garage. But instead, there was a pause. And in that pause, tension began to build. Community members and supporters began gathering outside legal buildings, including the state attorney's office, calling for accountability. Their message was consistent. A young man had died, and they wanted to know how the system would respond. The atmosphere was not calm, but it also wasn't chaotic. It was persistent. People returning again and again, asking for updates, asking for direction, asking for resolution. For Keimo's loved ones, each day without answers felt heavy in a different way. The emotional weight of loss was now paired with the uncertainty of what justice would look like in this case. At the center of it all remained the same unanswered divide. One account described an accident during close interaction. The outcome showed a fatal chest wound. And between those 2 points, the system was now being asked to decide what truly happened. But as pressure increased, officials continued to review the details. Statements, evidence, and circumstances were all being examined before any final legal step was taken. It became clear that this was no longer only a private tragedy. It had entered a public space. And with that came expectation, scrutiny, and rising demand for action. Still, for those closest to Keimo, none of it changed the central reality. A young man they knew, laughed with, and planned a future with was gone. And the question of accountability was now tied directly to how his final moments would be legally understood. The system was now part of the story, not as a place of answers yet, but as a pressure point where grief and demand for justice were beginning to meet. As the investigation moved forward, the case shifted from a developing story to a formal legal battle. Jahara Malik was eventually charged in connection with Keimo Lollar's death. The charge brought against her was manslaughter, placing the case in a category where intent, responsibility, and circumstance would all be closely examined in court. She appeared before the court as an adult. At her first appearance, bond was set at $50,000. Along with that release condition came strict supervision, including an ankle monitor and house arrest requirements. Her movements were restricted while the case remained active, ensuring she was monitored throughout the legal process. From that point on, the case split into 2 competing positions. On one side, the prosecution emphasized the seriousness of the outcome. A 17-year-old had died from a stab wound to the chest. They focused on the fact that regardless of how the situation began, the result was irreversible. Their argument centered on responsibility and how a deadly weapon became part of an interaction that ended in loss of life. On the other side, the defense maintained a different interpretation. Their position remained consistent. This was an accident. They argued there was no intent to cause harm, framing the incident as an unexpected escalation during physical interaction that went wrong in an instant. Between those 2 arguments, the court was left to weigh a single central question. Was this a deliberate act or an unintended tragedy? Outside the courtroom, Keimo's family continued to push for accountability. For them, the focus was not abstract legal definitions. It was the loss of a son, a student, a young man who had been building toward his future. They followed the proceedings closely, attending hearings and watching as the case slowly moved through the system. Public attention also remained steady. The details of the case, especially the claim of horseplay, continued to circulate and spark debate. People questioned how such an explanation could align with the outcome that followed. At the start of the legal process, Malik entered a plea of not guilty. That plea set the stage for what was expected to be a longer courtroom battle, with both sides preparing to present their version of events in full. But as the case progressed, something changed. In March 2026, there was a shift that altered the direction of everything. Her plea changed to guilty. That development immediately raised new questions that lingered far beyond the courtroom itself. Because if the incident was truly an accident, why change the plea? The answer to that question was not immediately clear in public discussion, but its presence reshaped how many people viewed the entire case. What once appeared to be a strict disagreement over interpretation now carried a different weight. The legal stance had shifted, and with it, attention returned to the core events of that night in the Liberty City parking garage. Even as the court process moved forward, the contradiction remained difficult to ignore. An explanation of horseplay. A fatal chest wound. A guilty plea entered months later. Each part existed within the same case, but did not sit easily together. And as sentencing discussions and final proceedings approached, the focus began to narrow again toward the moment everything started. Not the courtroom, not the charges, but that night itself. Because despite all the legal movement, the central question had not changed. As the case continued through 2025 and into 2026, progress in court did not move quickly. Hearings were scheduled, then pushed back. Dates were set, then adjusted again. Each delay meant the same thing for Keimo Lollar's family, another moment of waiting without closure. For them, time inside the courtroom did not bring relief. It brought repetition. Each appearance meant returning to the same facts, the same questions, and the same memory of what happened on December 20th, 2024. And each time, they were forced to sit with it again. Outside the legal system, support for the family did not disappear. People continued to follow the case, to speak about it, and to show up in small but steady ways. The name Keimo Lollar remained present in community conversations, not as a distant case file, but as a young life that had been cut short. When the guilty plea was eventually entered, it brought a complicated reaction. For some, it felt like a step toward accountability, an acknowledgement that the case had reached a point of resolution within the system. But for Keimo's family, the feeling was not simple. It was not fully relief, and it was not fully closure. It was something in between. A sense that part of the process had moved forward, while the emotional weight of the loss remained unchanged. The reality stayed the same regardless of legal developments. A 17-year-old was gone, a future had been interrupted, and a family was still trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Even as the court schedule continued to shift, the absence in their lives did not. There were birthdays that would never be reached, milestones that would not come, and a silence that replaced what used to be daily presence. The waiting became its own form of difficulty. Not knowing exactly when the case would reach its final stage meant living in a space where the past could not be closed, but the future could not fully begin either. And through all of it, the community's attention remained steady. The case was not forgotten, the questions did not disappear, and the search for understanding continued alongside the legal process. But for the family, every delay simply extended the same reality. They were not waiting for information. They were waiting for resolution. And the longer it took, the heavier that weight became.
Who horseplays with a knife?
The courtroom was packed, mainly with supporters of the victim and his family, several begging the judge to put Malik behind bars.
I ask you, Your Honor, to hold Jahara Malik accountable.
The state said they were not seeking to jail her and explained why.
The defendant in this case is 17 and had no priors. That is the only reason the state is not lockstep with the family.
The judge considered evidence presented by the state to include text messages where she allegedly talks about harming others and that Malik was known to carry a knife. The judge also saw this video purporting to show Malik in a violent fight at her high school.
I need to speak with you.
The judge ultimately siding with the state and making sure Malik knew what was at stake.
If I receive word that you are not abiding by house arrest, I will take you back into custody. Do you understand me?
Yes.
By the time the legal process reached its final stages, the direction of the case had become clear. Jahara Malik's guilty plea was confirmed in court, formally closing the argument over whether the case would proceed to trial. What had once been a disputed account of events was now legally resolved within the system. With that plea, the focus shifted to sentencing. Under the charge of manslaughter, she now faces a potential sentence of up to 30 years in prison. However, the final outcome is not automatically fixed. Because of her age at the time of the incident, there remains the possibility of a reduced sentence under youthful offender considerations, depending on how the court ultimately weighs the circumstances. As of now, sentencing is still pending, with proceedings expected to continue toward May 2026. So while the plea has been entered, the final chapter of the legal process is not fully closed. And even with that legal direction in place, the emotional impact of what happened on December 20th, 2024 has not changed. Keimo Lollar's life was still cut short at 17 years old. The court process has provided structure to the case, but it has not changed the central reality of the loss. And when cases like this reach their conclusion, they often leave behind more than just legal outcomes. They leave questions about how quickly everything unfolded, and how a single moment can reshape multiple lives at once. As the final sentencing approaches, the facts of what happened remain unchanged. But the interpretation of those facts has carried this case through every stage of the justice process. And in the end, the question that started everything still lingers in the background. How does a moment meant to be horseplay end in a life being taken? That is the question this case leaves behind. In the end, this case always comes back to Keimo Lollar, 17 years old, a student at Miami Northwestern Senior High, a football player with structure, discipline, and direction in his life. Someone who was actively building towards something he cared about: graduation, adulthood, and a future that was still unfolding. That future never arrived. Instead, it ended in a parking garage in Liberty City on December 20th, 2024. A single moment that changed everything, leaving behind a family forced to live with absence rather than presence. Birthdays that will never come. Conversations that will never continue. And milestones that will remain unfulfilled. For those closest to him, Keimo is not defined by a case file or a courtroom outcome. He is remembered for who he was before that night, his drive, his focus, and the way he carried himself around people who knew him best. And yet, the legal process has now given structure to what happened, even if it hasn't erased the emotional weight of it. A guilty plea has been entered. Sentencing is still ahead. But even with legal steps in motion, the reality of the loss remains unchanged. Because no court outcome can return what was taken in those final moments. What stays behind is a story that still raises difficult questions. About how quickly situations between young people can shift. About how fragile moments of conflict can become. And about how one decision can alter multiple lives in an instant. One moment, one decision, and a future disappeared. So what really happened in that parking garage? That is the question that continues to linger long after the facts are laid out. And if you've been watching this far, thank you for staying with the story. Subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories for cases that leave you wondering what went wrong, or leave you with more questions than answers.